All right. From what I can tell, and I'm going to read, by the way, guys, welcome to the stream. I'm going to read a statement I put on Facebook earlier today because I thought it kind of expressed my thoughts on this complicated issue that I'm not entirely sure what to think about. And I want to explain what this interview is about in a nutshell. So here it is. From what I can tell, there is something of a controversy going on at the moment in New Testament scholarship. There are sincere Christians on both sides of the issue, but the issue is important, and I want to see more discussion of it. To that end, to get more discussion of it, I am interviewing Dr. Lydia McGrew today, and that is my guest. She's with me already. I'll show her to you guys in just a moment so we can hear her interact with this issue. What's the issue? The issue is the existence of what's called literary devices in ancient Roman biographies, which appear to modernize, to allow authors to change details in pretty dramatic ways in some cases, and whether the gospel authors, the authors of our gospels in the New Testament, actually use these literary devices. So from our perspective, it looks like they changed a lot. Mike Licona is probably the most effective proponent of an affirmative view, and Lydia McGrew has been promoting a negative view, saying the Gospels are a reportage model, which I'll have her explain that, and don't involve what she calls fictionalizing literary devices, a term I think we should try to understand. In my opinion, you can be a faithful Christian, and you can hold either view. That doesn't mean, though, that both views are totally cool and okay and true. There are significant implications to consider, even if it doesn't impact the truthfulness of Christianity. I'm not personally decided on all these issues. I don't really know exactly where I stand or who I agree with and disagree with on the areas here. So my guest today is going to share her thoughts and her work for you and for me to consider and think about. But Dr. McGrew's work is like clarifying and thoughtful, and since I don't see her getting nearly as much of a voice online as the pro-literary device crowd, there's a lot of voices being proponents for that, but not so much for the other side. So I'm giving her a place to be that voice. Further, and this is the sad elephant in the room part, some people have forgotten that this issue is about Scripture, and they seem to be treating it as if it's a personal grievance between thinkers on different sides. I think this is unfortunate, unwise, and ultimately unhelpful. To put it bluntly, people like me, which a lot of my audience, you're like me, you don't care so much about personal grievances on either side because you see that as secondary to dealing with the issues at hand about the truthfulness and identifying what's going on in the Gospels. And so I care about those people. I don't want anybody to have hurt feelings. I just think that that has no place in this discussion. So here we go. Let me introduce to you my guest, Dr. Lydia McGrew. She is a widely published analytic philosopher, homeschooling mother, author, and the wife of philosopher and apologist Timothy McGrew, who I really like. Your husband, by the way, he's great. And she received her PhD in English from Vanderbilt University in 1995. She's published extensively in the theory of knowledge, specializing, which is really difficult actually even to think about, in my opinion. So good job there. Specializing in formal epistemology and its application to the evaluation of testimony and to the philosophy of religion. She defends the reliability of the Gospels and Acts in her books Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts, and The Mirror or the Mask, Liberating the Gospels from Literary Devices. That's actually, I have it right here somewhere, but that's actually the book that prompted this discussion. So welcome, Dr. McGrew. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, so let's start with the audience who's listening, and here's how we're going to do it. First, we're going to talk about this really simplistically. For those who've never heard the concept of literary devices, you don't know what a literary device is, you just want to know, here, ease me into this conversation. What is this all about? Then later, we're going to go into a lot of details, and Lydia's going to be talking about very specific, points in the debate that are worth unpacking. So we're going to deal with that later. If you're a pro on this topic, that's what you're going to want. If you're a noob, you're going to want this beginning portion for sure. So could you walk us, as if I know nothing about the issue, explain to me what this stuff's about?
So here's the very short version, the very short overview. The theory under consideration, which I am then disagreeing with, is the following. The gospel authors considered themselves licensed by the standards of their time to change various facts, some big, some smaller, some details, in their gospels in invisible ways. This would be somewhat like creating a movie based on true events, like a biopic that you might go to. So that's the theory on the table. I disagree with that theory, and I refute the supposed evidence for that in my book, The Mirror or the Mask, and then in a follow-up video series I've had. I address both the claimed external evidence, that is, evidence from other sources, and the claimed internal evidence, which would be like the claims of evidence that we find these in the Gospels, in alleged discrepancies and differences in the Gospels. And then I also provide positive evidence that instead the Gospel authors were careful and they were truthful and they never changed the facts deliberately, even on small matters of detail. So my book has both a negative vector and a positive vector, and these work together. These are connected with one another. So that's the very short overview of the controversy.
Could you give us just one case in point, like sort of an
Sure.
example of one an example of a what a literary device would be that you would say this is something I'm not okay with, or I think is inappropriate to ascribe to the Gospels?
Or is not there. Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So here's an example. And I did, I'll just do two. I'll do you twofer. So I've just done recently a whole series on my YouTube channel on the temple cleansing. So that's kind of a good quick example that's easy to understand. And the theory that I'm countering there is that there was only one time that Jesus went in there and he drove out those who sold doves and the money changers and so forth, that only happened once, and that one time was at the end, shortly before he died. And then the author John in his gospel came along and said, well, I'm going to move that and I'm going to have that be at early in Jesus' ministry, like not all that long after he was baptized or not all that long after the marriage of Cana at the beginning. I'm going to make it happen at the beginning. So this would be actually changing the time, like that John deliberately makes it look like it happened early, even though John knew that it happened late. So that would be an example of one of these alleged compositional devices. I believe that Dr. Lacuna calls that displacement and moving it in time. And so I don't think that John did that. I think that there were two temple cleansings. There are some people who think that John moved it, but not in the sense of changing the time, but rather in the sense of just narrating it at a different place, but not trying to indicate it was early. I don't think that works as a theory either, but I just think that there were two. So that would be an example. Another example just happens also to come from John. I've been working on a book on John recently. That is claimed is that when Jesus was hanging on the cross, he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that's recorded in what are called the Synoptic Gospels, which are the Synoptic Gospels are Matthew and Mark and Luke. And then the theory is that he did not recognizably say, I am thirsty or I thirst. Like if you'd been there and you'd spoken the language and so forth, you would not have heard him say anything like that. But that John took it and he kind of did this like theological symbol, this theological symbolism to make it look like Jesus said, I thirst. And in fact, in John, they even run and get wine for him. So it's made to look realistic, but that it didn't really happen in a way that you would have seen if you had been there. But that in John's mind, this was like a reference to the spiritual state of feeling like he was forsaken by God. It was like this private symbolism that John had. So that would be another example of an alleged literary device that I think is completely unjustified. It just looks very obvious. He was hanging on the cross for 3 hours. So obviously he could have said both, my God, why have you forsaken me, and I thirst. So that would just be two examples just to kind of kick us off.
Okay, so let me try to summarize in my words, and I want you to correct this if you feel I get any part of it wrong. So the case from guys like Dr. Mike Licona, who, by the way, I on a personal level, I really like Mike. Also, not that that's super relevant to the discussion here, but also really appreciative of some of the work he's done. Even in my own debates on the topic of the resurrection, I used much of his work, although I know you have your own work on that topic, which is also really valuable. And on this issue, though, I think what Dr. Licona is saying, or other guys like Craig Keener, what normal Christians hear is, so you're saying the gospel writers just lied about it. And that's really not what they're trying to say. What they're trying to say is, no, there's like standards for ancient biography. There were accepted conventions. Now, hypothetically, if their case is accurate, there were these known conventions, and conventions like adding information or taking information away to a greater extent than what our modern minds would think is acceptable, that was normal back then. And altering things like saying I thirst, and that didn't happen, that was actually expected and okay. And they try to build a case from this, saying we have Greek sources that do this, that tell us they did this, and then we have the Gospels, their Greco-Roman biography. They're of course doing the same types of things. So they're not saying they're not intending to say that the Gospel writers made things up that were untrue. What they're intending to say is they did normal biographical reporting, which to our eyes looks like maybe they did that, but if you understand it in its context, you realize no, this is normal accepted reporting. So it'd be like me saying, man, I went fishing and I caught 1,000,000 fish. Well, that's acceptable exaggeration in our culture. Outside of our culture, somebody might think Mike's a liar. And so that would be like the most, I think, a charitable way of presenting their case. Would you say I've explained their case hypothetically accurately?
I think you have, but there's a lot to unpack, and
Oh yeah.
I'm glad you stated it that way, because I think that raises several different things. So let me make a distinction right at the beginning between you gave a good example there that I caught 1,000,000 fish.
Yeah.
That would be an example. Or we have a thing like I have a frog in my throat. Like if I get thirsty here in our
Yeah.
interview, I have a frog in my throat. I need to get a drink. Nobody thinks I literally have a frog in my throat. Those are what we would call figures of speech. So somebody who knows the conventions of our speech would like recognize them immediately, right? If somebody heard you say, I caught 1,000,000 fish,
Mm-hmm.
he would immediately know. He wouldn't need to go like look it up somewhere else or compare it to some other version of the story you told or something. He would know right away that you didn't really catch 1,000,000 fish, and so forth. So those are figures of speech. What they're claiming, although I mean they will occasionally make an analogy to a figure of speech, but I think that creates confusion. What they're claiming is something a little different, and I think the analogy, which by the way does come from Dr. Lacona, that I just made of a movie based on true events, is a better analogy. If you go to a movie based on true events, I don't go to enough movies, but so I used a kind of outdated example in The Mirror of the Mask. I used the movie Chariots of Fire, and some people know that movie. It's one of my favorites,
I've
so
never
I know it
watched
really
it.
well. Okay, so all right.
Yeah.
So if you went and you watched that movie, or Dr. Lacona will use Apollo 13, which I don't happen to have watched, or Black Hawk Down, I think is another one he'll use. So it's based on true events. You go to that movie, you see it. Just by watching that movie, you can't tell which parts were changed and which weren't. Now that's right away a difference from I caught 1,000,000 fish.
Yeah.
Because just from hearing you say that and knowing the language, and the way that and the size of fish and stuff, we know you didn't
Yeah.
really catch 1,000,000 fish.
Right.
All right. Whereas if you go to a movie and it makes it look like something took place in 1924, it's, you're going to have to go look it up on Wikipedia or something to
Mm-hmm.
find out that it didn't really take place in 1924. The movie itself, you're not going to be able to tell the difference. And so the idea is that the Gospels were more like that. And so then the reason they don't want to use the word deception is not because, like with I've got a frog in my throat or I caught 1,000,000 fish, the original audience could tell right away, like, aha, that part isn't literal. That's a hyperbole. That's a figure of speech. Not because they could do that, but just because, as you put it in a different part of your comment, they were okay with it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. But within the work, it's invisible.
Yeah.
So the audience would be conjecturing just as much as we would be conjecturing about which part was and wasn't literal.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there wouldn't be some like Wikipedia article on Jesus' crucifixion that you could go look up that would tell you, Jesus didn't really say, I thirst, but in the movie, John, the gospel, he made him say, I thirst. Like they wouldn't have any other way of checking it.
Yeah.
They would be guessing just like we would be. So from their perspective, it would be invisible, but they don't want to call that deception for the same reason that we don't call Chariots of Fire deception when they make one of the runners, he meets his wife in a year when he didn't really meet his wife.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why is that? Because we're okay with it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
we've got to make a distinction between being okay with it and sort of, as we would put it, lowering our expectations. So that is really putting information in there that's inaccurate. So, I mean, the information that runner, when he met his wife, as portrayed in the movie, is inaccurate.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, on a propositional level, it's not accurate information. But the idea is supposed to be that we just manage our expectations as we go in. We go for more for entertainment than for factual content. And we know that if we want to know more, we have to look it up. Now, the problem is that where else are we going to look it up? The Gospels are our original source documents.
Hmm.
So unfortunately, if they were right, hypothetically, this would place a lot of stuff with a question mark over it, and we would go out into this realm of conjecture where we would say what we would be guessing, and so would the original audience
Yeah.
have
So
been.
there, so there may not be a consistent method of identifying where these devices are used or not used. It seems to me. I think the one that and probably will connect with my audience watching for you guys is when I heard the explanation of the raised bodies at the death and resurrection of Christ as being how Mike Licona put it was a type of special effects. And the suggestion there, as I understand it, and of course I don't know if he's changed his view on this or what his current thinking is on it, but when I heard him talk about this a couple times, the statement was that Jesus dies, and according to Matthew, there are these several saints that are raised at the same time as his resurrection. It seems the tombs broke open. My reading of the text, tombs broke open, and then they came out during his resurrection. And his statement is basically like, yeah, well, that didn't like actually happen the way you're thinking when you read the text. It was special effects because Matthew is doing a normal thing, according to Dr. Licona, that he's emphasizing, the spiritual importance of the event, the magnitude of the death and resurrection of Christ. And I heard that and I thought, okay, that's a lot more than like a paraphrase. That's like a lot more than, say, condensing a story. This is something else, and something that seems to me far-fetched. Maybe you could, is that a good example of the type of thing that you're talking about?
Yes and no. What's interesting about that one is that in some ways it's less radical. I mean, when you heard it, you were like, "Whoa, that's more radical than I thought these things were." I It's kind of interesting. I wrote a blog post about that one because that one became famous,
Yeah.
and because it became such a center of controversy, and I wanted to almost talk about other stuff in my book, partly because that one was almost too famous. You know what I'm saying? And so, like, I wrote a whole blog post about that one, and then I put a footnote in my book, and I'm like, yes, let's talk about that, but I don't want everybody to think it's just about that one.
Yeah.
And here's what I mean by saying that one is less radical. So let me try to explain that. What Dr. Licona claimed when he originally brought that one up earlier, and then his 2017 book had like a lot more in it. Okay, so he brought that one up in his 2010 book. The claim was that that was so exaggerated, sort of so over the top, and that in other works of the time, when somebody said something that over the top at the time connected with someone's death, then that would itself serve as a way that the audience itself would actually pick that event out. That they would go, oh, he's saying all this over the top stuff happened when this guy died. Aha, we know that when somebody says that over the top stuff happened when some guy died, some famous important person died, we know not to believe that. So an analogy I would make to what he was claiming would be if you were listening to an Irishman tell a story and it seemed pretty realistic, and suddenly he goes, and then I met a little green man sitting on a toadstool, and he had a pot of gold. Okay, A, he's an Irishman. B, he's
I'm
describing
an
what's
Irishman, by
obvious.
the way.
Okay. If you tell me a story and you tell me about a leprechaun, all right, even if I'm believing you up till you get to the leprechaun, the minute you get to the leprechaun, I'm going to say, okay. So that's going to be like what I would call a tag in the text. Now, I totally disagree with Dr. Licona about that. I don't think that this was tagged. I don't think that people would have. In fact, Matthew specifically says when the centurion saw the earthquake and the things that were done, he was amazed. And the opening of the graves is rolled in there with the earthquake. It's like this whole list of so-called, over the top events. It's just one of them among them. And it says that the centurion saw the earthquake. So that makes it look really realistic. So I disagree with him factually about it. But the nature of his claim was such that it would, at least if he were right, have been possible to pick that one out. The majority, and that's what I mean by it being less radical, because the ones in his 2017 book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, like the two I just gave you and many more, you couldn't even have picked them out like that. Even if you knew they didn't look like leprechauns, okay?
Yeah.
Even the original audience. So he says at one point, John appears deliberate in his attempt, I'm quoting from memory here, but it's almost exact. John appears deliberate in his attempt to lead his readers to think that the Last Supper was not a Passover meal. Now, I disagree with him there. I don't think John's trying to lead you to think that, but that's what he said. And yet, according to him, it was a Passover meal, and I also think it was a Passover meal. So the idea is that John is like really kind of embedding this deeply in realism of his document so that the audience could not have picked it out at all. And at least with the raising of the saints, he tried to claim that the audience could have picked that one out. And they're all like this. I mean, I could give you example after example where it's written, and he will tell you it's written in a very, very realistic way, so that all the audience could do would be to just sort of, I would say, take everything with a grain of salt. Like if you, just like with a biopic, if you know to bring enough salt into the movie theater, as it were, and take enough of these things with grains of salt, you won't be misled because you knew you weren't supposed to take too much of this or more than the very big picture literally. And that's how these are.
Okay, and now and to try to like, give us again like a framing for our discussion here, you've got then this case that, hey, Greco-Roman biographies did these things, and that's a whole part of the case they have to build. Then the New Testament authors were also doing those things. Okay, that's a second thing, and then the result is that it means this isn't deception in their case. This is simply normal conventions for writing. It does leave us in a bit of a conundrum about did that actually happen, or was this part of the storytelling? And however, it doesn't leave us completely like, oh, just throw the Gospels out or something like that. Would be overreaction, I think. But it does raise some questions. Now, your case is different. You actually have a case for what you call the Reportage Model. Could you explain briefly what you mean by that?
Yeah, so what I mean by the Reportage Model, I always put it pretty simply in two terms. First, the gospel authors were always trying to get it right, and I mean that in a literal sense. And second, they were very highly successful at getting it right. Okay, so this would mean that they never deliberately changed anything or made anything up factually. Now, I have various nuances of that we can elaborate upon more as we talk. So, for example, that doesn't mean that they had a tape recorder and that they verbatim recorded every word that everybody said. So you get these verbal differences, like that God the Father at Jesus' baptism says, you are my beloved son in one of the Gospels, and he says, this is my beloved son in another of the Gospels. Trivial verbal difference. And of course, we'll find that all the time in witness reportage. Memory is naturally paraphrastic. The human memory, naturally, we tend to put things in slightly different words. We get close to what the person said.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that it's verbatim. And I'm also not saying that everything was always narrated in order, and we can talk more about that, about order of narration. But I have these nuances to that reportage model, but at a minimum, what it means is that they never deliberately said, hey, that happened this way in this year or whatever, but I'm going to make it happen in a different year. Or I'm going to add this detail, like that it was this person's right hand, even though I have absolutely no way of knowing whether it was his right hand or his left hand. I'm just going to say it was his right hand. They never did stuff like that, and that's the reportage model, and then I bring positive evidence for that.
All right, so from where we've kind of laid some groundwork for people to understand our conversation, what do you think we should start with now? Like, what would be the best thing for us to tackle next? And we're going to get into the weeds, guys. We're going to go deep on these issues. It's going to be a long interview, but yeah. But I thought that it would be what people are hungry for, because they want some details.
Yeah. Well, I've addressed a little bit about paraphrase. I think what I'll do is say a little bit more about paraphrase now, and then maybe what we could talk about is time ordering or chronology, because I think that's an important distinction to make as well. So a little more about paraphrase, first of all. The word gets used in a lot of different ways, and I just used it in a very natural sort of way. If I overhear somebody say, this is my most athletic son, and then someone else reports it, maybe he'll report that the father turned to the boy and said, in front of the other people, you're my most athletic son. So that's going to be a paraphrase, but that's going to be very recognizable. If you were there, you'd recognize that as the same event. Sometimes these scholars will use the word paraphrase in a very different way that I think can be confusing. So imagine the story where Jesus says, "Your sins are forgiven you," to the man who was paralyzed. Okay, he's claiming to be God implicitly, right? Jesus is, because he's saying he has the power to forgive sins. So that's claiming to be God, and they say it's blasphemy. Now, a paraphrase of that would be, "All of your sins are forgiven you," or "Your sins, which are many, are forgiven you," or whatever, that kind of thing. Okay, somewhat different wording. That would be a paraphrase of what Jesus said in that incident. But now imagine that John was sort of, shall we say, inspired by that incident, and he went over and he constructed an incident that did not recognizably occur, where Jesus is speaking to the crowd in a different city. All right, the thing about sins, that's in probably Capernaum.
Yeah.
And let's imagine this other scene in Jerusalem, and Jesus says, "I and the Father are one." Okay, and then they get angry and they take up stones to stone him. And let's say John knew that that incident did not recognizably happen at any time in Jesus' life. But he said, "I'm being true to Jesus' message, because Jesus' message, I'm being faithful to his meaning, because his meaning and his message was that he was God." Now, I'm sorry, but that's not paraphrase.
Yeah, and they'll
And
and
the
they'll actually
word,
use the term paraphrase to describe that kind of thing. Jesus over
I'm
here
afraid
says,
so.
"Your sins are forgiven," and I know the passage well. I've taught it not long ago. and then
Mhm.
and then they say, like, who can forgive sins but God alone, and all this. Yeah, but then John, from that, is inspired to say Jesus just basically said he was God. Or "I'm one with the Father," a phrase that has different meaning. It has very different meaning than the first.
It does. And then the claim is that this is like a paraphrase because it's true to the meaning of the claim to be God, the underlying message, or something like that. So when you hear a phrase like "it was true to the meaning," or "it was faithful to the meaning," I mean, I'm sorry to have to suggest being a little more pushy, but sometimes you do have to be pushy and say, "But okay, but did this happen in a recognizable way?" And then maybe you'll get a discussion of, well, Jesus might have been speaking Aramaic, so John had to translate it from Aramaic into Greek if he wrote his gospel. Yeah, fine. That's not what we're talking about. If you'd been there and he was speaking Aramaic, you spoke Aramaic, you would have been able to recognize that this was that scene. That's
Mhm.
not the same thing as inventing a scene. So that's not
Yeah,
paraphrase. So
and I
I
get that this is
definitely want to make
challenging
that distinction.
because it's kind of a question of, like, okay, how much do you stretch a familiar idea to us, like paraphrase, and apply it to
Mm-hmm.
something that seems pretty unfamiliar in that for that
Mm-hmm.
terminology? And
Mm-hmm.
again, it's going to come down to, well, that was what they did, and you need to learn their practices back in the first century. We'll talk more about that as we
Sure,
continue.
sure.
Yeah.
But we need to be clear to one another, right? I mean, when we're talking, even if you want to say, "Well, I think it was okay for John to make up that scene." Okay, but if you're talking to a modern audience, you should tell the modern audience in clear English words, because you're speaking English,
Hmm.
what John did,
Yeah.
instead of calling it paraphrase, which could confuse your modern audience as to what you're actually, what you actually have in mind, what you're actually describing. So, and I agree that there is this question of degree. Philosophers, we sometimes talk about something we call a beard problem. And Mike, you have a beard. I'm sure when you were
But it's not
growing
a
your beard,
problem.
it didn't grow overnight, right? Didn't grow
No,
overnight.
no, it
And there
took
was an in
3 days.
between. Oh man, that is pretty fast. But
I
anyway,
don't
there was
know.
an in between time in there,
Yeah.
right? So people will say, and this literally, I mean, it's known as a beard problem in philosophy. We call it that. We also call it a sorites. A sorites is a heap.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have 1 grain of sand, 2 grain of sand. When does it become a heap?
Yeah.
You've got a guy with a 5 o'clock shadow, and it gets longer and longer. When does it become a beard?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there can be a tendency to say that because there are fuzzy cases here in between, then there are no clear-cut cases.
Yeah.
Now that's a fallacy.
Mhm.
That's a false,
Yeah.
and I mean it's the same thing with, if you've got your child and you say you have to go to bed without dessert, that's not starving your child to death. If you say to your child that you have to go to bed without dinner, well, that's a little more radical. If you tell your child you can't have anything to eat for 3 days, now we're over into child abuse territory.
Yeah.
So just because there are in-between cases, that doesn't mean there are no clear-cut cases. Same way with paraphrase. Just because there are looser and closer paraphrases, that doesn't mean there are no things that clearly, yeah, that's a paraphrase, and other things that clearly, no, that's not what how we would use that word, and it's going to confuse us if we call it that.
Great. And I think that actually this is one of the problems I've had as and there's a lot of stuff, in all honesty, that Mike Licona has been saying. He's the guy I've been hearing most of this from. And I go, I agree there, I agree there, I agree there. But then I feel like it's being applied to things I don't agree on, right? I feel like there's a lot of maybe stretching. That's my sense of it is. There's a lot of stretching going on. So I go, yeah, well, that's a great example of differences and not being a big deal. Yeah, this was acceptable. I accept it, you know. And then that's sort of applied to examples that I go, wait a minute, like the John example you just gave, where I go, that seems like a whole different kind of thing. Yeah.
It does. And I do want to say, for clarity and charity's sake, Dr. Licona has not absolutely committed himself to saying that John did that concerning I and the Father are one. What he has said is, and that it was a position that was taken by Dr. Craig Evans in a debate in 2012 with Bart Ehrman, and then in a recent interview, I believe 2.5 years ago, that Dr. Licona did on Tim Stratton's Free Thinking Ministries podcast, he said, well, if a gun were put to my head, I would say that. I would take this, what it's called a broad ipsissima vox view. Ipsissima vox means the very voice, and broad is like what I was just talking about. And so it's like he hasn't quite said, he definitely thinks that,
Sure.
but that is, shall we say, the position in question, or the issue, or the statement in
and
question.
Those examples
on that
help. Yeah, they help people like me, who to go, oh, that's what you mean. Okay, so you're meaning a much more flexible, to put it mildly, version of reporting the information or doing a biography than what I would normally expect if I'm reading the text. And it does. It's not the same as saying the Gospels are wrong. It's not that. It's saying the Gospels are doing something different than you think. The question is, are they really doing it? Are they really doing that? Because if they're, here, let me just say this: if they're not, if these literary devices aren't actually as firmly factual or real as they're saying it is, and the gospel authors themselves aren't actually tapping into those devices, then the end result is we're saying things didn't happen which did, and which the Bible's saying did happen. And so there are consequences to that. Yeah.
Right. And actually, I would say there are consequences even if they're right about the literary devices. Because if you think about it for a minute, Dr. Licona says these were part and parcel of the genre. And when you start looking at all of the ones that are conjectured, it's like, what if you really thought the Gospels were like biopics? Well, how much information do you try to get from biopics? We're pretty limited in how much information we can get from biopics. And this is where I would go to talking, if you say the information was wrong, there's a sense in which the information that's in a biopic may just be wrong. I mean, it's incorrect. It's not necessarily moral. I'm not saying it's morally wrong for the director to do that, but it really does limit the amount of information we can derive from it. So the theorists will make what I call these utterly unforced errors. And what I mean by that is that they'll just put a question mark over something even when there is no apparent discrepancy. Okay, now the I thirst one is actually a pretty good example there, because there isn't some apparent discrepancy. It's not like the other Gospels say he didn't say I thirst or something like that. There's no conflict there. And it's astonishing when you look at it, the number of places that this question mark will be put in. So in a recent video, one of his response videos to me, Dr. Licona was talking about Jesus' dialogue with Pilate. And he got to the part where Jesus says, everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. And he said, now, maybe John thought this was a good place to remind his readers of the saying, my sheep hear my voice. And so maybe he had Jesus say, everyone who is of the truth hears my voice, as a kind of a callback, as we would say, to my sheep hear my voice. In other words, he made it up. He inserted Jesus did not recognizably say that. And then he said, now I'm not saying definitely that he did that. It's impossible for historians to know. Okay, and that many times in Why Are There Differences, the phrase impossible to know, impossible to tell, we cannot tell. He uses the word informed guesswork at one point, the phrase informed guesswork. So what happened, and again, this would have been true of the original audience did not have a decoder ring. Okay, nobody's offering us a decoder ring either. All right, just as we would be if we went to a biopic. So because of the number of times this is coming up, it actually would involve placing question marks over a pretty high proportion of the information that appears to be found in the Gospels. So like I would say the implications, if they are right, are pretty major. And the implications, if they are wrong, are actually in a sense better, because then we can just go back to taking it at face value.
Yeah, and I'm probably stepping outside of my actual knowledge of things when I make a hasty prediction here, but here's my thought is that in the historical Jesus studies, when scholars start feeling like they can sort of reconstruct without really clear reasons to reconstruct the historical Jesus, they end up making a Jesus of their preferences, right? It ends up resulting in all these different images of Christ from these different historical Jesus scholars, whereas really the image of Jesus we should see is the one in the New Testament. This is just only one Jesus, right? And this is him. My fear is the same thing will happen with this literary device thing, is that we'll end up having a bunch of mutually exclusive versions of what the real story is, because we're sort of subjectively saying, I'm going to call that literary device, but that is historical. And then over here, that's literary device again. And since I don't have a clear indicator in the text of when it's a literary device, I think the tendency is going to be to sort of go off of my preferences. And so, well, I find that far-fetched, so that's literary device. I find that believable, so that actually happened. And my concern here is that you won't get a cohesive, that 10, 20 years from now, when a bunch of people are focusing on this, which they probably will, we're going to find a bunch of varying and contradicting reconstructions of what supposedly really happened.
Well, and you can see that even in a given claimed literary device. So take that one I just happened to bring up about everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Obviously, either Jesus said it or he didn't. I mean, he was speaking in, I don't know what he and Pilate were speaking, probably Greek or Latin. But anyway, I'm not saying he said it in English, but the point is either he said something recognizably like that to Pilate or he didn't. Those are not compatible, right?
Yeah.
So right away, the person who says Jesus said that, and I think, John had some kind of source or whatever that told him Jesus said that, somebody who was present, and he reports that accurately, is not agreeing with the person who says Jesus didn't say that, right? So right away, even if we don't have a strong preference one way or another, we definitely have incompatible views there, because either he did or he didn't. The other thing that I think is going to happen, and I forget if I coined this phrase or if my husband Tim coined this phrase, but the phrase is the redactive fog. And I really like that phrase, that this fog descends over Jesus. And you know how in a fog you can sometimes see the outlines, like if it's an SUV coming toward you as opposed to a little Toyota or something. So maybe some of those big outlines of Jesus will still be visible in the fog, but we're going to lose a lot of stuff about Jesus. And I think pastors find this important. This was a point that my friend Tom Gilson has made. And he has said to Dr. Lacona, you need to help pastors, because there are pastors out there preaching that Jesus really said, I thirst. And they're drawing conclusions from the fact that Jesus said, I thirst, like it's evidence of his humanity, or that of his suffering and so forth. And even these things that maybe you don't think are a big deal, but pastors need to know whether to preach about them or not. Okay, imagine getting up on Sunday and having to ask yourself over and over again, well, I don't know if I should preach about that because I'm not sure that really happened, even though there's no apparent contradiction and the text seems to be asserting it in a pretty straightforward way. It would make a big difference to our Christian practice, I think.
Well, how about we talk maybe about some more of the examples? You mentioned paraphrasing and the stretching of the terminology beyond what we would expect.
Hmm.
And then what about like chronological issues? You mentioned you wanted to talk about that. So I know you mentioned in
Yeah.
your book achronology versus dyschronology.
Hmm.
And I thought that was a valuable distinction. And you make a lot of valuable distinctions for those who are interested in Dr. McGrew's book. She makes all kinds of careful distinctions, even towards the beginning of the book, that I find are helpful. Now, yeah, anyway, we'll let you get into that. Talk about chronology, yeah.
Yeah, chronology. So, um, sometimes you'll see a sort of caricature of something like a reportage model or a more conservative model of the Gospels that everything has to be narrated in order. But we do find the Gospel authors don't always narrate things in the same order. So if you take Jesus' temptations in the wilderness, so one author will narrate, the thing on the roof of the temple in a different order from turning the stones into bread or something like that. There's these different temptations in the wilderness. And Luke and Matthew, I believe it is, narrate them in different orders. Well, obviously, that wouldn't be compatible. That would be a discrepancy if we took them to be saying, this happened number one, then this happened number two, etc., right? To be giving an order, then their orders would conflict. And so Dr. Craig Blomberg has talked about the Greek words that are used there, and that there are these Greek words that just mean approximately what we would mean by like and or but or something like that. They don't mean next or first. They don't have to indicate an ordering. So if I said yesterday I went to the store and I prepared some material for my talk with Mike, I may not be intending to say that I did it in that order.
Yeah.
So when the author doesn't intend to indicate an order or to indicate a length of time, like suppose I summarized some things I did and I didn't tell you that they took 2 different days, but I just didn't say one way or another. Maybe I'm not trying to say that it all happened in one day.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's what I call achronological. And this resides in the intention of the author, that the author doesn't intend to be saying that they happened in that order or in a certain period of time. Dyschronological narration is when the author knows what order or length of time it took, but he deliberately changes it. So, like the temple cleansing example I gave you. So, I was talking about the theory that John, like, he knew it took place in Passion Week, but he moved it to shortly after the marriage at Cana early. That would be dyschronological narration if it happened.
Mm-hmm.
So when I say that I'm opposed to uh, fact changing compositional devices in the Gospels, I don't think they used them. I'm talking about, with chronology, dyschronological narration. Achronological narration, somebody might call that a literary device. Like, for example, suppose Luke grouped a bunch of Jesus teachings about prayer. He has a place where he has, and he's just like, he said, right? You could call that a literary device if you wanted to, because he's trying to group it. But if it's achronological narration, he's not really changing the facts about chronology because he's not telling you a chronology.
Mm-hmm.
He's not even trying to imply a chronology. So that's really important if we're to understand where that burden of proof lies, because I would say there's a heavier burden of proof when you say that an author has engaged in dyschronological narration. If you're just saying he just kind of narrated these things as he thought of them or something, and he wasn't telling you which one happened first, which one happened second, that's such a common thing that there's not a very heavy burden of proof. But if we're going to say, no, he had this motive and he had this symbolism he wanted to give or whatever, and
Mm-hmm.
he was moving it to a different time, then we need more evidence. And I would say we need quite a lot more evidence than what the theorists usually bring. So I think that's a really important distinction.
Maybe another distinction we could talk about is that you mentioned the difference between, and you mentioned it already, but we can target it right now. Literary devices, which some of which you would agree with, but I don't think you would call them literary devices. You would say these are things we've always been talking about. Why are we calling them literary devices? But then also what you call fictionalizing literary devices. Help us understand that distinction, if you would.
Yeah, so we gave an example earlier, like I caught 1,000 fish, or I caught 1,000,000 fish, or something like that. So figures of speech. So there's a place in one of the Gospels, I think it's John, where it says, Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him. Okay, now anybody conversant with the times would know that the governor is not going to like personally scourge this guy. So that would be similar to saying in our own time, if I said, I'm building a house. Now, if you know me, you know I'm not even 5 feet tall. I weigh under 100 pounds. I am not personally building a house. If I say I'm building a house, that means that I'm paying a contractor. I
Sure.
bought the property and whatever. Okay, so that would be, you might call that a compositional or literary device. That's a figure of speech that's immediately recognized.
Hmm.
Um, so what I talk about instead when I talk about fact changing, and sometimes people get a little triggered with the word fictionalizing. So if you prefer fact changing, but where there it's like this is the way it was, but this is the way I'm going to make it be.
Hmm.
So when we start saying the author is making it happen this way in his story, even though it happened this different way, then that's what I call fact changing. And that's where I have a question about it, and I want to say, okay, what's your evidence that the author did that? And one interesting point that I often emphasize is that mere difference hunting is not enough as evidence. So merely saying, well, in this gospel it says that Jesus said, I thirst, and in this gospel it says that he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Well, it's a mere difference. That's not going to be enough to show fact changing. And I would go further. I would say mere discrepancy hunting or apparent discrepancy hunting is also not enough to show that one author changed the facts. Um, because even if you find an apparent discrepancy, you still have to ask, well, is there some plausible explanation of this? I would also go to the secular documents, and we can talk about those when you're interested. Plutarch, for example, I
Sure. Let me
find
let me
that,
just preface for the
yeah,
audience
no,
the
no, go
the,
ahead.
the
Yeah,
reason why these documents are important is because the case that the literary device group is making is to say, if I understand it right, and I'll mention this again because again, if this is the first time you heard this, it doesn't hurt to hear it twice. That there were these textbooks that Greek learners, people who are learning to write Greek stuff, like for instance history or poetry, that they were learning from these textbooks, and these textbooks actually taught them to use these literary devices that, to our eyes, would greatly alter the information. And then in addition to that, okay, that's the textbooks. Then in addition to that, Plutarch is seen as probably the prime example of someone who does it in action. And so Plutarch wrote a bunch of different biographies. They're called lives. And you can take the same story he tells in different biographies, and Mike Licona does this in his book, and compare them. And he says, look at how the stories are different. This proves that these literary devices were not only taught in the textbooks, but they were actually used in real life. And Plutarch is the biographer of ancient Rome. So yeah, I think that's the basic case to say, look, see, it's a real thing, and the Gospels are doing that too. Now, if you
right.
would go ahead and delve into that
No,
topic.
no, go ahead. So take for example the fact that in one of Plutarch's lives, um, he's talking about Caesar, and Caesar weeping and saying that at his age, Alexander the Great had conquered the world or something. Alexander the Great had done much more, and that he feels he hasn't done enough at this time in his life. So Plutarch seems to be placing this at a certain trip to Spain. Now he just introduces it as when he was in Spain, but it's plausible when you read it in its context, that he has a certain trip to Spain in mind. And then you go to other authors, not Plutarch, and they tell approximately the same incident, but they say it happened in a time of a different trip to Spain. That Caesar took a different trip to Spain, and they're like 7 years apart. And so then the claim is, see, this is displacement. All right. So then this is supposed to mean that we see in action, it was acceptable to move things. Well, now notice what's happened there. What we've done is we've done what I call discrepancy hunting. We found an apparent discrepancy between Plutarch and these other authors. Which trip to Spain was it when Caesar was bewailing that he hadn't accomplished as much as Alexander the Great? And we've said, boom, that's a literary device. Like Plutarch moved it. What if we skipped over? Well, I mean, nobody's committed to saying that Plutarch never made any mistakes, right? I mean, Plutarch is just a secular author. And let's also remember that this stuff is found in scrolls, okay? I mean, you don't have it in like a searchable form. You can't just call it up. Plutarch couldn't just call it up on his computer and Alexander the Great trip to Spain, and find it and make sure, and check it. It's not easy at all. If he's going by memory of reading these other sources, he could very easily remember it was on a trip to Spain and just narrate it at a trip to Spain that was the wrong trip to Spain. Okay, so discrepancy hunting gets used in these secular sources to quote unquote find literary changes that are that we're neglecting more ordinary potential sources of difference. Okay, and sometimes it's even a mere difference hunting. So I'd like to give an example here again from Plutarch. In one of Plutarch's lives, Plutarch is talking about a debate in the Senate. Caesar is not getting along at all with the Senate. So, Julius Caesar, he's out there and they want him to give up his legions, and he doesn't want to give up his legions and so forth. And so in one life, because I would be risking getting the name wrong, I'm just going to say Senator A. So in one of Plutarch's lives, Senator A calls Caesar a robber. Okay. And Senator, B says that he should be considered a public enemy if he doesn't give up his legions by a certain day. And then in another life, Senator C is reported to be saying that Caesar is a robber, and that he should be and supporting the measure that he should be considered a public enemy. So Christopher Pelling is an Oxford classicist. I believe he's retired now, and a sort of person that Dr. Lacona has been following in his work. And Pelling suggests, and Dr. Lacona agrees, that Plutarch has conflated these sayings, put them together, and transferred them to Senator C. Okay. Now, there's not even any motive. It's just a difference. Maybe we think he did that.
Mm-hmm.
He moved
and
it.
that was an example of an accepted literary device.
Right, transferal literary device,
from
which
two
they
individuals
call
to one individual,
and to an individual which isn't even either of them. Mm-hmm. It's like it's this completely different, separate person, right? And so then in one of his suggestions, Dr. Lacona suggests that in Mark it says the voice of one crying in the wilderness, and that's the narrator. And in John the Baptist says, I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness. And he just suggests that maybe John the evangelist transferred, so there's transferred these words instead of, and it's not even from one character to another, it's from like the narrator in Mark to John the Baptist, the character, even though that it didn't occur historically. And that's just a difference. I mean, there's no contradiction.
For that example in Mark and John, what's your opinion of what the difference is causing that difference?
It just isn't reported in Mark. I mean, it's literally, there's no, the narrator doesn't say the voice of one crying in the wilderness. And by the way, John the Baptist never said this about himself. It's just that whole scene in John literally doesn't even occur. John the Baptist calls himself the voice of one crying in the wilderness in a dialogue with some messengers who were sent to ask him who he was. That dialogue doesn't even occur in John. I mean, but it doesn't occur in Mark. Sorry, that it's not even reported. Yeah. So it's not like there's even an apparent discrepancy. It's just that's a part of the story Mark just doesn't tell.
To me, that's
all there is to it.
A natural reading of the two texts is that one thing. It's not that what John's doing is coming from Mark, and then John's changing and transferring the content to someone's lips who didn't say it. Instead, it's more like they're both coming from actual historical events, and they're accounting them differently because they're both writing separately. So
Right. We know that there's tons of stuff that Jesus did that isn't reported.
yeah.
I mean, John says that the books could not even contain all of the things.
Yeah.
We know that John reports a far more extensive amount of material about Jesus' early ministry than the synoptics report. Are we going to call all of that into question now?
In particular
You know,
about John, he just
it
gives a lot of detail about John the Baptist. Yeah.
yeah. So that there it's like hardly even requires much of an explanation. So I would call this difference hunting, to go back to the Plutarch example. Do we not find nowadays in our political climate, and I do not mean this to be a political comment, but that people repeat the same things or similar things when they agree with one another?
Mm-hmm.
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to find different senators saying the same thing about a Supreme Court nominee that they don't agree with or whatever. And if more than one senator says it, that doesn't mean that somebody transferred it from one senator to another. That's how political bodies work. So there's really no problem with saying that all of these things that Plutarch said in both of his lives are true.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just look at the comment section on my videos. You'll see even this one, give it a week, and then look down and we'll see different people saying the same types of things, because that's just the way life is. Now, could we, and tell me if I'm jumping off Plutarch too quick, or we can come back to it, but I wanted to ask you about the textbooks. So one of the things that got my attention was, while I'm initially somewhat skeptical about the far end of the use of literary devices, and I go, well, the initial examples, I go, oh, that seems legit, but how far it's stretched seems to be a problem for me. But the case for it involves saying, look, here's what you don't know about history, which I'm always interested to find out, right? Here's Greco-Roman source books where they're using these to teach kids how to read and write Greek, including history. And they give practices where they actually require them to change details and do these literary devices. Am I explaining that right? And what would your response to that be?
Sure. Excellent question. So I've got several different parts, and I'll pause at each part, and I'll ask if you want to ask me anything further about that part. So first challenge is whether the gospel authors would have even been educated from these. The second challenge is whether the textbooks actually contain these. So those are various questions.
And
so
I was going to save the first question for second, but I was curious if you thought the textbooks are legitimately contain these. Now, I read in chapter 1 in Dr. Lycona's book, it seemed sparse, the data there supporting this. It just was like a quote here and there, and I thought there was going to be, I'm just being honest, I thought there was going to be more meat behind this. Is there a stronger case I'm not being exposed to? So I'm probably should be asking him this question.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it. And here is actually, what I would encourage you to do if you haven't had time, and I would encourage the viewers to do this too. Look at Dr. Lycona's and my video series.
And I have, by the way, I have those linked below in the video description on this video. I have a whole playlist of Dr. Lycona responding directly to Dr. McGrew, and then her playlist responding to his. So you guys can have all the info there.
Have a ball, because in one of those he has supposedly more quotations from the textbooks that are supposed to show it even more, and then I respond to that. But one of the surprising things to me about that is that if if I could put it this way, you just sort of turn off the sound and you don't listen to someone reading this in this very highly significant voice, and you just say, what does that quotation actually say? Yeah. It's astonishing that the quotation doesn't actually say, hey, it's okay to change historical facts. In fact, you can go through, I have read all of this book by Theon, was his name, who wrote one of these that was used in the 1st century. You can read the whole thing, and you will literally not find a single place where Theon says, it is allowable, like in so many words, it is allowable when you are writing history to move events around and to change things and to and to change things and then to make it look realistic, and your reader will accept that because it's just something that your reader expects you to do. Or say he doesn't say that anywhere.
Yeah.
Okay. These quotations are things like these things are very useful for this. These exercises are very useful for historians. Okay. useful in what sense, you know? Or
It seemed, and I'm just going to agree with you here. It seemed to me that the quotes fell short of establishing the case that these textbooks were being used in such a clear manner to
right.
teach
And I think
practices that others were adopting in other contexts. Yeah.
absolutely, and I think you'll find that with the additional, he adds a few additional quotations. That's why I
Okay.
suggested watching video. He adds a few additional quotations that he thinks are like knockdown, and you go read those, and they're similar. You know, they're things like history is a series of narratives. Yeah. You know,
Uh-huh.
and right, you know, these kinds of things. So yeah, but I want to read a quotation here from Dr. Lacona's Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? I think a lot of people don't realize this. So he says, there are many observations of differences in the pericopes. Pericope is a section in the Gospels, he's saying, that follow, for which potential devices are neither described in the compositional textbooks nor observed being employed by Plutarch. So I want to stop. What's he saying? He's saying he is admitting that he's attributing compositional devices to the Gospels that he doesn't even claim that he found in the textbooks or in Plutarch.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Let's continue. We will keep in mind that many of the compositional devices in use by Plutarch are likewise not found in the compositional textbooks, nor are they taught in any of the ancient literature that has survived. That's quite an admission. So he's saying that even Plutarch, even when he alleges that Plutarch is doing things, he's alleging Plutarch is doing things that he doesn't even claim to have found taught
And this is,
anywhere.
again, my concern is that it just gets, I feel like it just keeps getting stretched further and further and further
Right.
to,
Okay.
yeah.
And then he says, accordingly, much of what an ancient author did and why he did it will remain in the realm of informed guesswork for modern historians. So there's that phrase, informed guesswork. It's astonishing. And I call it a ratchet. If you ever work with a tool that's a ratchet, you ratchet something here, and then that's a fixed point, right? And then you ratchet it again and you move it more, right? So what we're doing is we're interpreting these textbooks in a certain way, and I have even more to say about that. Interpreting them in a way that I think is very mistaken to begin with. That causes us to sort of ratchet up our belief that this was acceptable. Then we go to Plutarch and we add even more devices that, like displacement, that one I just talked about, you know, or making a person say something that you moved it from someone else's mouth. That's not supposedly found in the textbook. Displacement isn't even supposedly found in the textbook. So we ratchet that up. We add those in because we claim we've found them in Plutarch. We went to Plutarch more or less expecting to find something. And so then whenever we find a discrepancy or a difference in Plutarch, we say, let's add another literary device to our little catalog, our list here. So now we've moved the ratchet, another thing. Then we go to the Gospels. Now we've got an even higher idea of expectation. We're going to find stuff. And now every place we find in the Gospels that something is different or that there's an alleged discrepancy, it's like, and it gets to the point where Dr. Lacona just uses the phrase literary artistry. It's just like it's like a grab bag term. You know, it doesn't even have any more specific term. It's just they changed this by literary artistry. It's not even on a list, you know? So we're ratcheting it up more and more, you know, each time. I'd like to say a little more about what I consider to be the misreading of the textbooks,
Okay.
because I think it's kind of important. So I want to talk about inflection a little bit here. So Greek is an inflected language, and you know what that means. Explain a little bit more for the viewers. Where you would change the endings of words. Many languages are inflected. Like you would change singular to plural, and we have singular and plural in English, of course, as well. Our adjectives don't tend to be inflected in a fully inflected language. You know, the adjectives have to agree with the nouns in number and all that kind of thing. And then the verbs will change in number, and there are all these different endings. So Greek is an inflected language. Classical Greek actually had three numbers. It had the singular, which is one. It had the dual, which is exactly two, like twins. And it had the plural. So it's like one, two, and more, and then three and more. Okay. So Plutarch, excuse me, I misspoke. Theon, the author of this textbook.
Yeah, and just for the audience, Theon. So Dr. Lycona in his book, he references multiple different textbooks, but only one dates back to the 1st century, and that's Theon. If my memory serves, that's Theon. That comes back to the first century, and so it probably has the most potential for applying to the stuff we're reading about in the
or
Gospels.
whatever. Right, and the others are very similar. I mean, they use, they have similar rhetorical things they're teaching and so forth. So Theon has these exercises about inflection, where you would have the boys and the students change the number of the nouns. So I want to give an example here. Isocrates, the orator, said that those with natural ability are the children of the gods. We inflect it as one person speaking of one other by saying Isocrates, the orator, said that the student with natural ability was a child of gods, and as two of two, that the twin orators, Isocrates, said the twin students with natural ability are children of gods, and as plural of plural, that the orators, Isocrates, said the students with natural ability are children of gods. So you can see what he's doing,
Yeah,
right?
it's
What is
like
he doing?
saying the cow jumped over the
Later.
moon, the cows jumped over the moons, the two cows jumped over the one moon. It's you're teaching
Yeah, yeah.
people how to use plurals in sentences.
Yes,
That's what it sounds like.
exactly. Duals and plurals, exactly. Now, there really was an orator, Isocrates. I mean, he was a historical character. I would hope that no one would think that Theon is teaching that it was okay if you were writing history to say there were twins and they were both orators and their names were Isocrates. Okay, obviously, this is not teaching about how much factual flexibility we have in historical writing.
And is it used that
But
way in Lycona's work? That quote?
for the singular and the plural, I'm sorry to say, yes, it is. The inflection, the device of inflection, and particularly inflection of number going from singular to plural. And then he references this section. He doesn't quote it, but he references this section on inflection in Theon, and says that it was a literary device to change the number of people involved in a scene. Like even if there was only one, that you could make it be two. Okay, like change it, like adding people to the scene who weren't there. It's also, and what Dr. Lacona does is interpret it that way and used that way by Dr. Keener. Dr. Keener, in his recent book, Biography, very recent book, is talking about the fact that Matthew has two demoniacs that are healed by Jesus, and Mark only mentions one. And this is kind of a well-known difference between them, and it definitely looks like the same event. Dr. Keener kind of takes Dr. Lacona's thing and runs with it and says, well, this could be the literary device of inflection, of making it be two demoniacs instead of one.
Yeah. Okay. So to my ears, it sounds like someone reading Dr. Seuss who says one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish, and then thinking, see, Dr. Seuss is training his students that it's okay to change the number of fish when they tell stories. And it's like, well, no, he's just talking. You're reading this to young people to teach them how to read and write.
And these are older young people. They're not as young as those who are reading Dr. Seuss, but I'm afraid that's not an entirely bad analogy. Some of them might not originally have spoken Greek. You have to remember the Roman Empire spread across, many different language groups and so forth, but Greek was the high language. It was the language, if you were going to be a rhetor or a writer, you were supposed to know Greek. Augustine complains about that. He hated learning Greek. I believe Latin was his original language. So you'd be teaching these kids to use the different forms of the words, but you're not giving historical advice on how to write history. And we find this happening again and again. So there's a passage where Theon uses, now this is what I think confuses people, like Dr. Lacona, he uses an historical passage as a kind of a takeoff, a jumping off point for the exercise. So it's a passage from the historian Thucydides about the invasion of a town, and then he says, now we vary the anecdote, the crea, the exercise, by having the student write it. You could write it all as a series of commands, Well, that would be what we would call the imperative mood. Come and defend your city, even though these people have broken through. Da da da. You do it as a series of commands, or we could do it as a series of questions. And then he imagines writing like a framed story. I have often wanted to ask you: is it really true that this happened? Yes, it is. And did this happen? So this is what we call the interrogative, teaching them to write the interrogative. Okay, and then he says. And in these ways, we vary the craft. And Dr. Laconia uses that passage to say that you were allowed to change the way things happened historically. Now, here's a thing right in that context that shows that that's not what Theon means. Theon says we may even have the student negate the entire passage. So the student would be practicing by writing, this did not happen, and this did not happen, and this did not happen, and then Theon goes, and so on to the end.
Yeah.
Now that's obviously just, nobody thinks that he's teaching them that if you become a historian, you read the story of the killing of Caesar in the Forum, and then you go, Brutus did not stab him, and this other guy did not stab him, and he did not fall with his toga over his head. Of course not.
So these are not variations. Then if we're to be consistent, we're to say, if you can negate the passage as a practice, then how can this practice be about how you record history? It's more about different moods and ways of talking about things. It's just like practice writing things out as question and answer, practice writing things out in negation, practice writing things out in affirmations or whatever. So
Bingo.
Yeah, that
Bingo.
And that to me was the surprise, because I'd heard personally, I'd heard Dr. Laconia offer these things, and I thought, boy, to me the gold is going to be when we look at those Greek textbooks and we see if these writing things are really a normal thing, if they're really training people to make the kinds of use the literary devices he's talking about. And then that's only part A. Part B is going to be to try to prove that the gospel writers are doing the same thing, because that's a whole different discussion. But I was surprised when I read that chapter, and I thought, is there more that I missed? And again, we have the playlist below where Dr. Laconia shares his stuff. This is just about the facts of the matter. And for me, I'm not a scholar of any stripe, but my habit is reading things in context. This is all I do, is study stuff in context, and I carry that habit into those quotes, and I go, I don't know if it means what you think it means here,
And we have an audience issue too, because I think sometimes we're a little anachronistic in thinking about the similarity of culture. So you have movies based on true events right now in South Korea and in poor people, rich people, people from all different countries and all different language backgrounds are familiar with that idea of a biopic. Children get it passed on to them just from their parents. Honey, it's just a movie. It might not have really happened exactly that way, right? The mom will explain that to them when they go to the movie. It's a very widely understood thing. You don't have to go to school and study special exercise books to know that a movie might change the facts somewhat, because we have what we call a common popular culture, right, across all different strata of society and so forth. That kind of homogeneity, as it's called, within culture is a pretty modern thing. It's a result of television and all these kinds of things. The internet now was not something that you would find in first century Palestine or first century Asia Minor or whatever, where everybody would just understand all the same things. So we do have to ask ourselves, how would the audience, because remember we talked about this would be supposedly an understanding between the author and the audience, where the audience would say, I'm going to suspend my expectations, I'm not going to expect too much factuality from these Gospels, because I recognize that they're in this genre of biography and they can change stuff. Why should we think that these are being read in the churches all over the Roman Empire, and that the audience had, read these textbooks or talked to somebody who'd read these textbooks and would just know, all kinds of things could be changed here. Don't take that too seriously. That's yet another step.
Okay, so I'm considering that maybe we should talk about the whether the gospel writers themselves would have had the Gospels would have been tied to these sort of whatever the Greco-Roman biography practices were, though you dispute that these literary devices are even an established thing to start with. So that already we'll set that aside. what do you see as the connection between, you know, the Gospels and those Greek trainings?
Right, right. So we've got a couple different questions there too. So one is, would they have been exposed to them? And the second is, if they're exposed to them, would they use them? Because, you know, you can be taught something, hey, it's okay to do this, and then say, you know, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to do that. You know, I mean, someone could be taught how to make a biopic and could say, but I don't want to do that. I want to make a documentary instead, right? He could say, I've got a different motive. My motive isn't to do this. My motive is to do something more, you know, more literally true. So we got a couple different questions there. So first, as far as exposure, we have this issue of who the gospel authors were. And this is where the question of authorship comes in. And it's been interesting to me that by and large, Dr. Licona does claim to affirm traditional authorship, though he qualifies that in certain ways in his recent video series. But, you know, that in some sense of it, Matthew was written by Matthew and Mark was written by Mark, and so forth.
I think he just emphasizes the use of like secretaries or an amanuensis.
Right, and that's what I mean about qualifying, and I'll get to that in a moment. But as far as the actual people, Luke would have been the only one where it would be plausible that he would have actually personally studied from such any such textbooks. Luke writes the highest Greek in the New Testament, with the possible exception of the Greek of Hebrews. I actually think Luke might have written Hebrews too, but that's a different question. But those are some of the, you know, the highest Greek. So he would have been fairly well trained and plausibly could have studied from these textbooks. But I definitely don't think we would have expected, if Matthew was Matthew the tax collector, that he would have studied from these textbooks. So would he have been exposed to that? So then, as you were just pointing out, I think you probably watched maybe that particular video, Dr. Licona's new theory, and as far as I know, this is original with him. I haven't seen this anywhere else, but is that they had a secretary who introduced these literary devices. Now, that's very surprising to me. A secretary, or as it would be sometimes called an amanuensis, was usually working on style. Even Richard Bauckham, who's not a super conservative scholar, he talks about the use of secretaries because he's talking about the authorship of John. And he says, but using a secretary, you took responsibility still for what was in there. You might dictate it to a secretary, and a secretary might, make your style better, make you sound better or something. But the person who's attributed to be the author, he still takes responsibility for the content. And so Dr. Licona is imagining something that I would call a co-author. So I think we should use the word co-author just to begin with, to get away from the word secretary, which I think sounds a little more minimal.
Because
so we're
the
talking about
secretary,
a co-author.
we might think of them taking dictation. And perhaps doing grammar changes here and there,
or stylistic changes or something like that. But we're talking about a co-author here. And so then what are we talking about? So John, first of all, John's style is not the style of a highly written, highly trained Greek secretary. Let's just start there. The very first place where you would expect the involvement of a secretary or an amanuensis would be on the style. So what we're supposedly envisaging is something very odd, where this amanuensis keeps this rather rough Greek, very simplistic Greek style. He doesn't change what you'd expect him to change, but he changes the events.
Yeah. So we have my thirst that on, hypothetically is a literary device. Yet the sort of the first task of the co-author, the reason why they're there, would be to clean up the Greek, make it more, make it sound
pretty.
better, right? Make it prettier.
Yeah, pretty.
So your thought is, if they're not doing, the first job, they're probably not doing the second thing.
And then second of all, what are we imagining? Let's give this guy a name. We'll call him Apollos. Okay? Apollos says to John, hey, in my Greek class, I learned about changing events, and I think it would be really cool to move the temple cleansing and add this thing about that maybe Jesus said I thirst even though he didn't really. And John goes, well, yeah, maybe my audience will be confused into thinking those things really happened, but never mind. We want to be up with all this new Greek stuff that you're learning in your Greek textbooks. Go for it, Apollos. I think that's highly implausible. I'm
So
just going to say outright,
yeah.
it's a very complicated theory.
So this theory of literary devices seems to affect gospel authorship, and if you want to affirm traditional authorship, which I do, then it's gonna probably require bringing in somebody else who is trained with this style and adding these things, and so it starts to feel we're requiring more and more adjustments to be able to support the theory. Like the theory is now driving our conclusions about authorship. That's
and we
how
call
it sounds.
that ad hocness.
Yeah.
Philosophers call that being ad hoc.
Mm-hmm.
When, like, exactly what you just described, it's requiring more and more to support. And notice too that we lose something that we thought we gained from traditional authorship. I mean, we thought that if we establish traditional authorship, what's one of the things we think we gained then? Factual accuracy, right?
Mm-hmm. You're getting closer to witnesses and better accuracy and all that. Yeah.
So we're taking away with the left hand what we're giving with the right. Mm-hmm. We're like, yay, traditional authorship, but actually that doesn't give you all that.
Now let me throw something at you real quick. So in the terminology you're using, I know the objection on the other side, again, from people I love and respect, is going to be, Lydia, you're saying accuracy, but we're saying that you're using the wrong terminology. Like, this isn't about accuracy. This is about understanding the conventions and the genre and all that. Do you want to speak for a second to that whole discussion? Because it does, even titling the video and writing the description, I realized everything I'm writing is contested by both sides. Literary devices, you're like, no, those aren't really literary devices. And then I say fictionalizing literary devices, and they say, well, that's not really fictionalizing. That's the wrong word. Can you help us? Just what's your perspective on that?
Yeah. So I want to be careful how I say this because I don't want to be offensive, but I said something that might help a little earlier in the video, so I'm going to go back to that. We're communicating with one another at this point, okay? And we need to have a thesis on the table that we can say, this is the thesis, and so-and-so says yes, and so-and-so says no, okay? So take a word like accuracy. When I communicate to you about when the temple cleansing took place, and we go and we read the book of John, and we say, okay, he's saying there was temple cleansing early in Jesus' ministry. Is that accurate or not? We know what we mean, right? We're talking English. We're both talking English. We both live in the same time period. We communicate with one another. What we mean by that is, at this time,
did it happen
when Jesus
early
said,
on?
It happened early on, right? We know what we're talking about. Now, at that point, we're just speaking clearly to one another. Even if it was a convention of the time to say you're allowed to displace events, that doesn't change the fact that in factual terms, it is correct to say then that would be making the information inaccurate. Notice that this is the case even in our own time. All right, we do have fact-changing literary devices, okay? We actually have them. So you go to a movie, and the movie appears to make this thing occur in 1924. And, they make it happen in 1924 in the movie. And it really didn't happen in real life until 1927. There is nothing insulting about saying that's inaccurate. That's not an insult. That's not misrepresentation. That's not denying the literary device or the literary genre or the literary nature. It's like, yeah, it's the literary genre to put inaccurate information in, and that's okay because they thought it made a better story that way.
We usually see a disclaimer based on a true story that we see.
Right, exactly. Sort of and we would say among ourselves, we'd say that's partially fictional. Right? And we wouldn't mean to insult anybody by saying that. Yeah. And we wouldn't be making a category error. It's like, no, we'd actually be describing the category. So I intend these terms as descriptive. Then we can talk about the moral dimensions or whatever of them separately, or we can talk separately about whether they happen or not. But if we do not have a descriptive way of saying what we're talking about, we literally can't talk.
Yeah.
We literally can't even have a conversation. So for me to say they're putting inaccurate information in there, that's not for me to, deny the literary device. I do deny the literary device, but I'm actually just describing the literary device there. I'm
Yeah,
just
if
saying,
you were
that.
to affirm the literary device, you'd still use that terminology. And I personally
Right,
don't really have
right,
an
right,
objection
right.
to it, although I would want those of us who are like really staunch to just say, look, and this is, maybe you would disagree, and that's okay. You can disagree with me all you want. Wouldn't be offended. And you've studied it way more than I have. But I would say that if these Greek texts really do teach the things that, like Dr. Lycona says, and if the gospel writers are using those same devices, then I wouldn't want to call it lying. But I would use a term like inaccurate or fictionalizing literary devices. I would think that's actually accurate on the hypothesis
I've been very
that this is
careful
true.
about that.
Yeah, and so I don't have
If
a
you
problem with
watch,
that.
if you watch when I do a presentation on this, you'll see me do exactly that. And like I gave a presentation at the National Conference on Christian Apologetics just a week ago. I think it was a week ago yesterday, on this very question, and I had a slide. Were these deception? The very thing you just raised. Were these lying?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, according to them, they weren't lying, just the way we would say a movie based on true events is not lying.
Yeah.
Because it was allowed or accepted, but it would be potentially confusing. That's how I put it, that you could confuse people. People could be misled because why? Well, because they didn't have enough salt. They didn't bring enough grains of salt,
Yeah.
just like I could be misled by watching a movie about what the facts were. So no, I actually agree with you. I would say it's fine to say this is inaccurate information. If we want to say, is it lying? Then we have to ask a separate question about what the audience would have understood. And here's an interesting point. I know some people who want to use what I call a smorgasbord approach. And they want to say, yeah, fine, I like the smorgasbord approach. The smorgasbord approach is, you grab a couple of these, like maybe, I don't know, 3, for passages that you find difficult, okay? And then you say, and that's all. And I'm not going to affirm the rest of them. And then what I've said to those people is, well, now you do have a problem with lying. And here's why. Because if it's a literary device of the time, you expect it more than just 3 times. You expect more than just 3 of them. When we go to a movie based on true events, we don't expect just one little thing to be changed. If it's only based on true events, we expect quite a lot of things to be changed. So if you're going to try to limit this to just 1 or 2 or 3, then you're not talking about conventions that were common. But if you're not talking about conventions that were common, then how come the readers wouldn't have been deceived? Then how come this isn't deception? So it's like a dilemma.
Let me ask you this, because I think it might help. Is some of the stuff that that I hear proclaimed when they talk about abscissim verba versus abscissim vox, like, is this a verbatim quote from Jesus, or is it kind of like a paraphrase of Jesus? I'm totally open to that. Like, I'm perfectly fine, and I think you are too, with the idea of a paraphrase. Jesus says it here, it's recorded slightly differently there, but they're both true to what Jesus said. I don't think we need to worry about that. We see red letters, we see quote marks. This is actually more of a modern convention, and we don't want to project that backwards in thinking that we need verbatim agreement across the Gospels. But this leads us to the issue of help us out by realizing there are a bunch of things that are being called, at least in their camp, literary devices, which you would affirm you just wouldn't call literary devices, right? Am I right in characterizing it that way? Could you tell us what are the things you would agree? This is there, this is usable, this is totally appropriate. I just wouldn't say that it makes your case for literary devices.
Yeah, I think a chronological narration that we talked about before is a great example there. Okay, so if we have Luke gathering up Jesus' sayings about prayer in a chapter, or gathering up Jesus' sayings about stumbling blocks or offenses in like a few verses or something, and he said this, he said that. That's a chronological narration. That doesn't make the case for dyschronological narration or these factual changes. So I want to give an interesting example here, and this is again just an erroneous interpretation. In in Christobiography by Dr. Keener, and this also comes up in his commentary on the Gospel of John, he cites the fact that St. Augustine said that the Gospel authors narrated as the Holy Spirit brought things to their minds, and that this might cause a different order of narration. Now, Dr. Keener cites this, and I think you see it if you go in context, to support dyschronological narration. So, like, he's talking about the cursing of the fig tree and what order did that happen? Did it all happen? Did it wither at once, or did it wither the next day? He talks about that in Christobiography. And he says, well, we need to just allow the authors their different agendas, and one of them has it wither immediately and one of them has it not wither till the next day. I'm paraphrasing Keener. And then he says, ancient readers didn't think that you had to narrate everything in order. St. Augustine said that the authors narrated things as the Holy Ghost brought them to mind. Now, what impression would you get from that? You'd get the impression that Augustine, undeniably an ancient man, is endorsing dyschronological narration. So I thought to myself, well, I wonder what Augustine says in the context. So I get that passage from Augustine from his Harmony of the Gospels, and it's just astounding to me. He does say that about as the Holy Spirit brought it to their mind, they narrated. But in that very same context, he says, if the order of the passage of the events differs, we must seek to harmonize them. But if no order is given, then we can just hold that they weren't, really in conflict, or So in other words, you don't even have to bother to try to harmonize them if no order is given. What is Augustine doing? He's making the achronological, dyschronological distinction. He's rejecting dyschronological narration. Keener takes that statement about narrating as the Holy Spirit brought to mind. He apparently, I don't know if he just forgot the context, or if it's that I'm afraid Keener doesn't make the achronological, dyschronological distinction in his work, and then he plugs in that quotation from Augustine as though it supports dyschronological narration, which is like exactly the opposite of what Augustine is saying. This is very serious. This is a very serious problem in interpreting and applying that passage.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I'm concerned about, is we take things that are, say a chronology or paraphrase, and those examples are given to build the case for literary devices. But we spoke over the phone. You said, or I guess it was on Skype earlier. You said these are just normal harmonization devices. Like they're being sort of co-opted as part of something that they're like a launch pad. It's like a diving board that gets you into the pool, right? And the diving board is all these sort of known, obviously used things in the Gospels, like paraphrase, chronology, and stuff. And then the pool is what looks to modernize, like fabricating events, putting things in people's mouths that were never there, people who never existed, even in some cases. And so that's the pool that I'm concerned about, not the diving board.
Right, and also we didn't need this new research for the pool.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the diving board, or whatever you want to call it, that other stuff, that was there already. Okay, it's in all the traditional Gleason Archer and all those guys. They were already doing that as harmonization, and that doesn't mean that they agreed with Lacona. Very much to the contrary. If they say, well, this is narrated topically in order or something, then they're stopping there. They're just stopping there, and then this additional stuff, it goes so far beyond that. We didn't need to be like reminded of that. That stuff is already what we might call a staple of evangelical harmonization. We had that already. So, it's sort of like with postmodernism, to the extent that it's new and different, it's wrong. To the extent that it's just saying something harmless like people make mistakes or something, it's not new and different. So you kind of take your choice. Now I want to say though that I have a positive case as well in the book, and I definitely this is a big book. It's, you can kind of see like how thick it is, right? And I definitely, I remember when I was writing it, somebody said nobody wants to read a 400-page I forget what word she used, rant or something, or negative argument. And it's not.
Yeah,
okay,
it's not.
Even though, that is part of why it's so long, because these claims are very involved. But I also have positive evidence for the reportage model. And I often find that people are a little confused about that because they think, well, just talk about the positive evidence, Lydia, don't talk about this other stuff. And it's like, but it's all very interwoven, because if the gospel authors were reporting these details accurately, then that gives us reason to think that they weren't changing the details.
Yes. So let's do this. We should talk about your positive case. And is to recognize this is I've heard people characterize your work as though it is purely a criticism, and that's actually not accurate. So please share with me, what is your positive case for the reportage model, or the idea that, and now this positive case does itself present a challenge to the literary devices case. That's true, but
Right.
what is your positive case?
It's indirectly, yeah. So and we can start with, like, I had an earlier book called Hidden in Plain View: Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. So people have seen Tim's presentation, my presentations on undesigned coincidences. They're like these puzzle-like fittings
I think
between
they're
the details of the
super
gospel.
interesting. Yeah, I love them. Yeah.
They're very cool, I think. So there are those, and those often confirm details. And so I want to emphasize here, a lot of times the idea is, well, no, who cares about this? None of this matters because it's just details. So you take something like the green grass at the feeding of the 5,000. There's an undesigned coincidence about that John says it was Passover time. And then Mark says the grass was green, and the grass isn't always green over there, but at Passover time, the grass is green. So it fits together. There's your puzzle fit, right? And each one only mentions one half of it. Well, that's a detail, right? I mean, you could say, oh, well, the gist is that Jesus fed the 5,000. Who cares if Mark made up the green grass? Well, for one thing, I care. But for another thing, it's confirmed.
Yeah.
The detail is in fact confirmed.
Yeah, so we have
incidental. Like didn't make it up.
Yeah, we have seemingly incidental, unnecessary details in one gospel that make sense because of the information from a different gospel. That doesn't, and there seems to be no intention here, no intention to cause the two to make sense together. And it's not just one example like green grass. There's such a number of these that you say, this is what it looks like when two different people are talking about a real event. Yeah.
Right. And then there are many, many external confirmations. And one of the things I try to do is I try to talk about the character of the authors. We are so fortunate and blessed by God that we have evidence about the authorship of the Gospels. We talked about this earlier. And you can contrast that. There are even books in the Bible, like we don't know who wrote First Chronicles, for example. I mean, even as conservatives, we don't really know who the final guy was, who wrote First Chronicles. But we have lots of traditional reason to believe that Luke wrote Luke, and specifically that the same guy wrote Luke and wrote Acts. So then you go do Acts.
Sorry,
You go
pardon me.
do Acts. That's okay. The cat is great. I love it when the cat shows up.
I don't think anybody else saw the cat except you, because the one I'm sending you is, the full image.
Oh,
My cat
okay.
sat here for like 5 minutes.
She was very fascinated by the conversation,
Yeah,
right?
she was.
Anyway, so you go to the book of Acts and you have all these external confirmations. And I did another talk at the National Conference on Christian Apologetics last week called Acts Gets Hard Things Right. I fitted in 12 of them. There were way more that I could have fitted in, little details of like geography and whatnot in Acts. Well, that confirms Luke because it's the same person. So why then, when we come over to Luke, are we saying, like Dr. Keener did this in a recent interview, well, maybe Luke made up that it was the right hand? So that in one of the stories about the healing of the man with the withered hand, okay, only Luke says it was the right hand, okay? And Dr. Keener did an interview. I believe the name of the YouTube channel was Kinda Christian. I don't know if you're familiar with that YouTube channel. It's like a seeker's channel, and where
Sounds
the
kind of weird.
person, the host, well, the host asks, he's a pretty good interviewer. He asks what he calls, tough questions about Christianity, but he's
Sure.
not hostile, And so they were talking about differences in the Gospels, and Dr. Keener was talking about this genre idea. And so he said, so an example would be that only Luke has that it was the man's right hand that was healed. And he said, now maybe Luke had a different source. So he was open to that. But then he was like also open to it that maybe Luke just
Yeah.
added
So
that.
this strikes me as
Right?
the concern I have, which is that people just have proclivities where they, without maybe clear justification, just go, yeah, that part was made up by the author. That part was
Or maybe. We
historical.
have no way of telling. Maybe. Who knows?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, like Dr. Keeter just said, maybe. He said, we have no way of testing it. That was the way he put it. And it's like, so we have to test like every separate little detail. Whereas
Yeah.
my approach to the reportage model, my positive approach, is that I try to learn something about the author, the kind of author he was, the kind of document he's writing, okay, and whether he would be likely to do that or not. So I would say when we find all these things being confirmed externally, then we can tell that Luke isn't that kind of author. And this is true within the Gospel of Luke, too. Like when he
Yeah.
says in the reign of Tiberius Caesar, and this guy was the tetrarch of Abilene, and Pontius Pilate was the governor. And like you can
Yeah.
go
Now people
confirm.
don't realize that these are really little details Luke gets right in Luke and Acts that are just, it's kind of astonishing because you couldn't back then go and do a bunch of research like online to find out what terms sailors used when they were talking about different issues, or what time of year sailors traveled in certain places. But Luke just includes all these incidental details, which you're saying, look, if he gets all these little details right, when he says the right hand, it's probably because Luke's just cares more about detail than some other people do, so he includes which hand was healed.
Or he heard about it. And
Yeah.
maybe, Mark didn't happen to hear it was the right hand. Maybe Luke talked to a different person
Mm-hmm.
who said it was, the right hand. So that's a kind of part of my positive case. It's this external confirmation. Another part of my positive case is the unity of character. So in T-Mom, as I call it, the mirror or the mask, um, link below. Anyway, I do the character of Peter. So you probably heard a lot of sermons about the character of Peter, and maybe preached some sermons on the character of Peter. That is apologetic value. It's really cool. We have all these different stories in different gospels about Peter, and they present this same very vivid person. And that's evidence for reportage, for the reliability of them. Peter's the guy who rushes in first at the tomb. Peter's the guy who says, Lord, even though they all betray or deny you, I will never deny you. He's like
Mm-hmm.
warm-hearted and impulsive. um, Peter is the guy who says, let me come to you on the water,
Yeah.
right there out, and he's like, Lord, bid me come to you, and so forth. And then he gets out there and he's sinking. Okay, that's his personality, and these are all different stories, but it's all clearly the same guy. So that's evidence. Now in my forthcoming book is to be called The Eye of the Beholder. Viewers, please follow me on Facebook and follow my YouTube channel and everything, because I'll be announcing that. We hope that book will be available for sale in the spring of 2021. So The Eye of the Beholder, the Gospel of John is reported, and the
I heard
report.
spring was canceled for next year, though. I think we're just going to do winter from now on after this. So that's what I was
And
told.
never Christmas,
Always winter, never
always winter,
Christmas.
always winter. Please, no, 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 no. We're gonna have Christmas. We're gonna have Easter, and Jesus is coming again. Anyway, but hopefully not before The Eye of the Beholder comes out, Lord. Anyway, so in that book, The Eye of the Beholder, I talk about the personality of Jesus, and that's obviously something people are really interested in.
Mm-hmm.
In a debate that he did with me on the Unbelievable show, which is a British radio show, Dr. Craig Evans said that if we didn't know better, if we looked at John's Jesus and the Jesus of the Synoptics, we'd have to wonder, are they two different people? He actually said that, that we have virtually nothing in the Synoptic Gospels that sounds like Jesus in John, except for a few verses in Matthew, he said. So like I refute that whole thing in The Eye of the Beholder by showing many different sayings of Jesus. Like, for example, he says, ask and you shall receive, and then he says, in hitherto you've asked nothing, you know, asking you will receive. So in other words, but these are different occasions. So we do find him actually talking the same
Mm-hmm.
often, actually. So that's evidence. That's part of the positive case. Another part of the positive case is unexplained illusions. So this is something I really love. Here's one from John. In John 7, Jesus says that if anyone thirsts, let him come to me. And then he says, as the scripture says, out of his innermost being shall come rivers of living water. And we cannot figure out what scripture he was talking about. It's amazing. If John felt free, as many scholars, including some evangelical scholars, think he did, to embellish and elaborate Jesus' words and kind of put interpretations into Jesus' mouth because he was inspired by the Holy Ghost, why would he put into Jesus' mouth an allusion to a scripture passage and nobody can figure out what scripture passage it is? Like, he didn't need to do that. He didn't need to put that as the scripture says part
Mhm.
in there at all. So, and Leon Morris, the late Johannine scholar, late great New Testament scholar, has pointed this out, that's very strong evidence that John is recording historically what the historical Jesus actually said. So those are unexplained allusions. You mentioned unnecessary details. We find a lot of these even when they're not confirmed by undesigned coincidences. So, for example, Mark says when Jesus was asleep in the boat, his head was on a cushion. He just adds that little thing. Or when they found the colt, he was tied outside in the street at I believe he says at the corner or something like that. So he's got this like specific place where they found the colt tied. There's no need to add those. Now you could say, oh, well, that was just to make it look real. One thing we need to know is there was no realistic fiction at the time. There was fiction, but there wasn't realistic fiction.
Where they tried to
Not
present
like
it like it was historical.
super historical, like super, what word should I say? Detailed, with a lot of what we would call verisimilitude, where you could read it and you're like, wow, I can't tell, if that didn't say a novel right on the front cover, I'd never know. It just wasn't like that. I mean, that wasn't invented for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later. So, and yet we have these realistic details that add verisimilitude to the Gospels. So that's just a sample of the things that I have in my positive case.
That's great. And all right, well, I don't know what else you have that you want to share. You've referenced your books. You've given us a ton of great information. But is there something else you want to share before we wrap this up?
I think I'd like to give just a couple more examples of the literary devices, maybe, just to kind of see. And I'm not going to go on and on about each of them, but I think this will just be to show where this goes or what these examples are. So we've talked about the I am sayings. Here's one: the idea of a doublet healing in Matthew. So Matthew has two blind men that are healed in Jericho. Matthew also has two blind men that are healed earlier, I believe it's in chapter 9. So in his commentary on Matthew, Dr. Keener theorizes that this in chapter 9 is a doublet. So what's a doublet? A doublet is when you have two events in the same gospel that look a lot the same, but there was really only one. And you could think of it as like the gospel author ran it through a photocopying machine, and then he made some changes, right? And then he ran it through the scanner, and then he has like what looks like a separate event. Okay, so that's a doublet healing in Matthew. And he seems to allude to that again in Christo biography, though not quite as explicitly, but it's quite explicit in his commentary on Matthew, and Dr. Lacona raises that possibility in Why Are There Differences? He doesn't commit to it, but he raises it as, hey, maybe this is something. All right. Here's one: John or Matthew relocating the appearance to Mary Magdalene after Jesus' resurrection. So in John, of course, we have that whole scene, right, where Mary Magdalene sees Jesus and she thinks he's the gardener. You're familiar with that scene. In Matthew, it says she came with the other Mary to the tomb, and then it just starts going they, the women, they, and they see the angel, and then they run to tell the disciples, and then they see Jesus. Very different circumstances. So if you insist that Mary is with the other women the whole way in Matthew, then this would be a contradiction, right? Because in the Matthew one, then she would be seeing Jesus when she's with other women. In John, she's alone. In the Matthew one, she would be seeing Jesus when she's already happy and she already knows that he's risen because the angels told her and she believed them because it says they run with great joy. In John, she's sad. She thinks he's still dead. Okay, etc. I mean, they're just completely different scenes. Now, I don't think there's any contradiction here. I think she left the group. I think that Matthew either just didn't know and so he just left it out. He doesn't say that Mary Magdalene was with the group. He just doesn't say either way, and that John then maybe talked to her and knew more details about how she came back later and saw Jesus. So this is what we call reconcilable variation,
Yeah.
which is actually another form of evidence for the text, that we have these differences, but that they're reconcilable in a way that's not implausible.
Yeah. And I
Dr.
mean,
Kona
and my
believes,
view would be the same as yours on that. When I looked at that stuff, and I did a video a long time ago, it's like, it's an overly wooden view, in my opinion, that tries to get the authors to say more than they're saying, that turns differences into discrepancies of a different kind. Yeah.
Amen. Say it again, man. No, that's absolutely true. And I often talk about this as like a still shot versus a videotape. So real life is a videotape. Mary Magdalene is with the other women, but we don't take a still shot of her with the other women and like, okay, it's a group selfie. Now she's going to stay with them the whole time. No, it's video. She can leave and she can run, somewhere else, back to Peter and John. So okay, Dr. Kona believes it is a discrepancy. And he's very explicit about this and why are there differences that, he doesn't like any of those harmonizations there of that. So he says either Matthew or John has relocated the appearance. Now you might just think of this as, like 500 feet to the right or something, but the relocating, when you stop to think what that means, that would mean creating completely different circumstances.
Yeah,
so like
it's
if John
more than
relocated,
relocating. Yeah, it's not just a time difference. It's a lot more than that.
Or even a little space difference. Yeah. Like it's like it was down the road where she had that conversation with Jesus or something, but it was the same conversation. No, it would be like if John, quote, relocated it and it really happened like in Matthew, it would be a made-up scene, essentially. So that would be an example. All right. Luke allegedly moving the appearance to Jerusalem. When the first appearance to the male group of disciples, and so this would be like everybody except Judas, who had hung himself, and Thomas, okay? And that Dr. Kona said in a debate with Bart Ehrman that it really took place in Galilee, and that Luke moved it to Jerusalem. Now, that's a big difference. Again, Galilee and Jerusalem are like not right next door to one another. Yeah. The circumstances would also be quite different because like in Galilee, they expect to see him. In Matthew, they go there with the intention of meeting him. They've been told, go and meet him. In the story in Luke, they're in the room. They've got the doors locked. They're musing on what's been happening that day. It's been this amazing day. It's that same day, and suddenly Jesus is among them quite unexpectedly. So it's very different circumstances. So that's another one that Luke supposedly moved it. So then he would have had to change the circumstances
and
quite a lot.
These are the things that raise my eyebrows as well. And I say, it just makes a lot more sense if you just let the stories read next to each other and not say that. I don't understand the appeal, to be completely honest. And yeah, it's a good example.
Yeah. And each of these examples that I've just given would involve eliminating a resurrection appearance. If you think about it, you're going to have fewer resurrection appearances. Because if you take Matthew and John to be describing different things, okay, then you've got the appearance to the other women, and that's separate from the appearance to Mary Magdalene. Whereas if it's that one or the other relocated, then you've got at most one appearance to the women. Or if, Matthew's describing one meeting in Galilee and Luke is describing an earlier meeting in Jerusalem, that's two appearances. And if you say that Luke moved it, then you've just eliminated a separate resurrection appearance. So there's that. It also makes it hard to fit in doubting Thomas, because if you think about it, John locates the doubting Thomas sequence firmly in Jerusalem, that he wasn't with them. Then a week later, Jesus appears to them a second time. So like if the first appearance occurred in Galilee, did doubting Thomas walk to Galilee? I just don't picture that. Hey, Thomas, come to Galilee, and just because. All right. So then we've got another one. And this is the last one I'll give tonight, but um, Dr. Lacona thinks that when Jesus breathes on his disciples, so you may remember that's in John 20, he appears and he breathes and he says, receive the Holy Ghost. So there's been all this controversy like, oh, did they receive the Holy Ghost more than once or what? Because there's Pentecost. And so what is that? That's a theological debate, right? And one of the points I've been making is we need to separate our theological debates and our historical debates, right? If Jesus did historically stand in front of him and they go, receive the Holy Ghost, then we can argue about what the theological meaning of that was, but it was an event that occurred historically in space and time. We shouldn't take our idea, well, Jesus wouldn't have given them the Holy Ghost more than once, so I guess this didn't really happen
Yeah.
or something.
Yeah.
Okay, so now this isn't original with Dr. Lacona. Other scholars, I would say not usually considered to be highly conservative scholars, but other scholars have thought this, that John invented this as a kind of odd allusion to Pentecost. Now, I don't think it looks like an allusion to Pentecost at all. I mean, there's no little tongues of fire. There's no mighty rushing wind. Like I think it would have just confused people like crazy. But so that's another one. So when you hear sometimes, I guess this is what I want to emphasize. They got the gist. They got the big picture. They didn't invent incidents. I would suggest that people would think about some of these examples, because what we have to be doing at that point is redefining gist, invent, and incidents, all of them, because I would definitely call some of those inventing incidents. And if those are examples, then we at least need to be clear about what we're talking about. And so what I would urge in wrapping up is that people would really examine this issue. Because I think a lot of times people say this isn't important. So it's like, who cares? They got the big picture right. They got the gist right. These are only tiny little details, so it doesn't matter. And gosh, it would take a lot of time. And gee, Lydia's book is big, and I don't want to read this. And I totally understand that. That's why I've made in multiple venues. I've done like videos. I've done blog series. I've done discussions like this one with you. So whatever format people feel most comfortable with, they can take that format and use it to kind of get an entrance into the issue. But what I would say is, don't accept this because you think like it doesn't matter. It's unimportant.
I think that what's
least
happening, if you ask me my honest opinion, and I know a lot of apologists and have had conversations even about this, but I think that maybe what's happening is apologists have more than one agenda when it comes to all these topics. They're thinking not only about what is the case, they're also thinking about what is my case. What's the case I'm going to present to others? And if you could take all of the challenges of discrepancies and issues in the Gospels, and you don't have to work at harmonizing each one anymore, it makes your job easier as an apologist, right? Because you just say, look, harmonizing is not necessary, because there's such a flexibility in the authorship that I don't even have to argue. And I mean, don't even have to deal with whether this passage is consistent with that passage or not. And I think harmonizing is extremely successful. I just think it's also tedious, and it ends up derailing conversations you're having when people are like, what about this passage? And then you go into it. It's just an easy and useful thing to say literary devices and then move on. And so I think that makes it appealing to apologists, but I think that apologists ought to recognize that that's not a good enough reason to affirm this thing, right? We need to dig deeper into it.
Well, and I think one thing you can see from the examples, that's part of why I gave this list, is the apologetic implications of these examples, the apologetic implications of this. Because suppose you want to argue for Jesus' physical resurrection, and you start saying, okay, Luke moved that, then I think it's quite understandable to ask, did Jesus really eat fish with the disciples, right? Well, is that not part of our case for Jesus' physical resurrection?
The physicality
that Luke didn't make
is about
it
the
up.
details.
The physicality is about the details. So we get that. Doubting Thomas. Okay. Apologists use doubting Thomas. They'll say Jesus appeared to skeptics, right? Well, but if we say Luke moved that, and then there was no room for the doubting Thomas incident, we can't fit
Yeah.
it in anymore. Now we've lost our ability to say Jesus appeared to skeptics. So I think we start, or if we want to defend the deity of Christ, we want to do cult apologetics, like apologetics with Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc. And we want to say, no, Jesus really said, I and the Father are one. At least he might have said it in Aramaic, but if you'd been there, you would have heard him say that, or before Abraham was, I am. And then you get somebody, who says, but wait a minute, but, Craig Evans says that's Jesus looking like an allegorical figure of Lady Wisdom, and he agreed with Bart Ehrman that he didn't say those things like they're recorded and so forth. Okay, suppose your Jehovah's Witness friend you're talking to has actually gone and done that research and found that out. And he's like, and by the way, Craig Evans is a evangelical scholar, and even he doesn't believe, even evangelical scholars believe that John did this. Now you've just had the rug pulled out from under you to some extent in the data that you have available to you to use in discussing. So there are definitely very, very significant apologetics implications of all of this, as well as to our Christian life and our Christian practice and our counseling and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. And it just seems like a formula for reading the Gospels wrong. And I mean, why on earth would I say that this Thomas thing happened somewhere else? Like, what presuppositions am I bringing to the text that are causing these things? But this is not new. And in your book on the Gospel of John, I'm sure you'll deal with this. But scholars, even Christian scholars, have in some cases been prone to invent wild things about the mind of John as he's writing different things in the past. And you're like, this isn't how you should approach any ancient text, let alone inspired scripture, in my opinion. So, all right, well, I think we've had a productive time. I know this has been a long video, but I think that's exactly what kind of a lot of people want. They wanted a little introduction to the topic, but also a lot of details from you. So thank you so much, Lydia, for coming and for joining me. And you guys can follow her. I have links for her content down below. You can follow her stuff. And if you'd like to get more details, I, again, don't know the answers to all these questions. It's obvious that I lean away from the literary devices thing. Not the sort of stuff we'd all accept, but how it's being used. The final conclusion, I go, hey, hold on. I don't think we can go there. That is my current opinion on the topic, and I thought it was worth talking about. I don't have enough time to make this a research project, so I decided to bring someone on to discuss it, and I hope it was fruitful. Other than that, I will see you guys on Friday at 1 p.m. That's when I have my Q&A. Monday, I'm dealing with the Mirror Bible translation. Next Wednesday, I have Neil Shenvi to talk about critical race theory, and then Friday again with the Q&A, because why should I sleep? All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike.
Yep, have a good one.
Take care.